Hey, hey,
Hello.
how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing good. Got my stack of books. Got my the things I want to touch on for the different masters, and ready to talk either amongst ourselves or with a guest or two, depending.
Good. I have movable type as an example. I just realized. Nope, the book's right here. Cool. And you're good with doing Alfieri?
Yeah, I can talk on Alfieri just a little bit. I mean, I think we're just going to cover these masters in relatively. Not going to go too much into it because the whole idea for this class is to give an overview of where this master fits in the Fabris tradition and to kind of um, whet the taste buds of people who might be interested in picking up the manual and learning more about Fabris or learning about that master on their own.
Sounds sounds like a plan. Yeah, I did a little overview of Alfieri with Robert because he's read through it, and um, but there were
Alfieri
only
is very
two real main mentions, huh?
Alfieri is a very accessible manual. It's very like it's not super intimidating when you start reading it.
Cool. It may be one I look into. I've really enjoyed all the research I've had to do for this class and kind of kicking my butt in gear. So thank you for being like, let's do this thing. So
Yeah, my I think I told you that my teacher back in Kai said that teaching is the most selfish thing he does because he gets more out of it than the students do probably.
I definitely think I did. Definitely some deep dives I would not have taken otherwise to make sure that my knowledge was solid. So and start out talking about books.
Let's say it again.
Start out talking about books.
Yeah. I mean, you can. I was gonna start with yours. I can. One second. Let's see. Let's see if we've got anybody else. As usual, we'll give it a couple minutes to see who's going to join.
Yep.
Otherwise, we'll be giving this to the YouTube viewers.
That also works.
Yeah, we've been getting some decent views on it.
Yeah.
I think more people like to kind of pick it up later. So it's kind of a double-edged sword that if you post it on YouTube, then people might be less likely to come to the class itself. But
It's a time that, like, if you can make it, you can make it. And if you can't, it's hard to schedule
yeah,
around it. So,
my whole there's Arik.
isn't it?
Hey, Arik. Oh, we have one more too.
You.
Yay.
Oh, it's Caradwin.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for being our guests. Letia and I were saying that more people like to view it on YouTube than generally participate in the class itself, but that's okay. Give it one more minute and then we'll start. All right. So Letia, I'm just gonna go straight to the slide deck, and you can jump in and out. Okay.
Well, are we talking about kind of books overall first?
We can do that. We can talk about the books overall first.
Cool.
So, and then
I think that might give a base.
Okay. All right.
Let us know if you want to see if anyone else is joining or if we should go ahead and jam.
All right. So it's 11:32. So we are going to start. All right. So, hey, everybody. So this is the last of the Fabris Luncheons. And in this class, the purpose of it is that Letia and I will give an overview of a selection of fencing masters and manuals that continued in the Fabris tradition throughout the 1600s. And we're going to be going through Huessler, Vienna Anonymous, Koopa, Alfieri, and C13. So we're going to start out with Letia giving a bit of an overview, and she'll do Vienna Anonymous, and then I'll talk about the other fencing masters, and we'll, as usual, just kind of jump in and out with each other, giving our thoughts about it. So Letia, why don't you start with talking about the books?
Cool. So we have a selection of books that have existed from 1600, but we don't necessarily know what else could have existed and what other small notes could have added more to the information, or if there were other masters that had books. And I caveat that with, while Gutenberg did his printing press and it's like 1440 and everybody's like, whoa, now we have reading. That's not actually, the more we're discovering, that's not actually how reading and literacy might have worked. There's a lot of examples of lower end scraps of books that did not get passed on from generation to generation because they weren't important. They were way more ephemeral because they weren't these great masterful works of artwork that were heritage pieces that got put in treasuries. There's actually some examples of more writing for the more middle class and lay people. As we're discovering more of that, we're starting to learn literacy was a little different pre-Gutenberg press, which leads us to the press happened and everybody thinks of the book explosion. And while there was quite an explosion compared to previously book writing, it doesn't mean that books were easy like they are now. They were still works of a lot of labor, and works that, even though they were a lot of labor, they were still made of things that were susceptible to insects, susceptible to mold, susceptible to flooding and fire, and all of those things that were common to destroy works. So we have a lot of possibilities that could have existed, and a lot of ways that that books could have been destroyed, and we no longer have that information. So when we look at some of the really awesome, interesting things like Anonymous, we don't necessarily know the context of that. We don't know if this was pre somebody about to write a book that was going to be published, or if these were personal a teacher's notes taken from other classes. It's got a lot of information, but it's hard to know the exact context of the use because we don't have enough surviving partial manuscripts of that time to really see. There's a lot of things that we don't think about as having been written, like books that would, much like libraries a few years back where they would give you like Xeroxes and you had to go copy from the library Xeroxes. There would be scribes that would copy parts of books for lay people, or for educational uses for college people, because it was really expensive to print a book. And once you set the type, so the type was movable type. It was these little, my light's really bad today. It was these little blocks, and you would put the letters side by side. They were hand carved. And so once you finished an edition of a book, redoing it, being like, oh, I need 3 more copies. Can we just make 3 more copies was not feasible. And the number of copies was also, we think about, oh, the printing press, boom, it's like modern printing. But they at the late 1500, printing presses could do between 1500 and 3600 impressions per day, which sounds like a lot, but when you break it down, that's a 150 page book. That's 10 of them, and that's not resetting the type. That would be, 1500 pages. So if you wanted an edition of a 150 page book and you reset the type once per day, which is a large part of the work, or twice, 2 or 3 times per day, that's still like 50 days to make a single book for 1,000 editions. So these things were still pretty rare, and you probably needed notes and other ways to handle your manuscripts. So something like Anonymous may have been notes from Fabris so that he had his personal copy. It may have been a book he was about to write and notes towards that. And we just don't know. It's written in 3 different hands. We're going to move on to Vienna Anonymous now. It's written in 3 different. Do you have a? Okay. It looked like you're going off mute for a second. So it's written in 3.
No, I'm gonna pull up the slide that I have on it.
Cool.
So let's see. Share the screen. And here we go.
Oh, that just took over my screen in really strange ways.
Sorry.
Can you guys still see me? Okay. It stopped taking it over. So we have Vienna Anonymous, and he is a very interesting work because it is written, and there's a foreword by Leone who did this translation. I think it was last year, a year and a half ago. But he did this translation, and he writes very nicely in the front about the different hands that are in it. This was not a printed book. This was all handwritten. And again, we don't know the end goal. We don't know anything about the actual writer other than he was in, that he writes that it is, hold on. Finished in Cheb in the year of salvation 1614, month of September. That's pretty much the most we know about actual facts. There's no copyright. There's no anything like that. So we don't know anything about the writer beyond that. There are 3 hands. We don't know if the original hand was his notes to go to publishing with notes on the side. We don't know if it was a teacher that wrote something for a student. And it's a very interesting take on Fabris because it uses a lot of notes from Fabris and from Capoferro. It's notated throughout the book. And it gives a lot of almost an annotated version of Fabris. So you go through, and a lot of what is said in here is some slight clarifications to Fabris, perhaps something you could have gotten from the text, but has more specifications. So you're like, oh, just written in slightly different ways. So when you put the 2 together, it gives a little more information and a little more knowledge of the base. I feel like if I had not read Fabris first, this would be harder to gain the depth of information of Fabris. But it also has a lot of areas that are more clear and more concise. Certainly his sections on some of the tempo moves, he'll be more precise about tempo, or more precise about some of the body placements that you can see in the pictures. There are no pictures in this book. It's all just, it's about 50 pages. And they're short pages, a lot of them. So it's like half of a page. I don't know if you can see my screen at all still, but it's about half a page for some of them. So it's fairly short. And it just gives some better explanations overall if you've already read Fabris, and it might be a little lacking if you don't have the other book to reference. It also pulls in some of Capaferro's writings and references, so it kind of mixes them both, which leads to that a lot of Italian fighting at the time had similar theories with just little like different approaches, just kind of different potential stylistic changes and theory changes of, oh, well, you know, the same way we have dance that has slightly different, like it's this, but with more of a this lean or more of a that lean towards it. Dance might have been a bad reference because there are way too many types of dances. So forget that as a reference, to take that one back out. The other thing that's interesting about, that I find interesting in Anonymous, is he references LS a lot, possibly as in a similar manner. Certainly Fabris is the most referenced, so it does, you know, almost annotate information from that the most, but LS is referenced almost as much as Capaferro, or fairly similarly. And we don't know anything about who LS was, if that was another famous fencing master, if that was something from their teacher, and it's just lost in time. Because as I said, while we think of, oh, the printing press, boom, thousands of books, they were still hard to make, they were still rare. And so, you know, I think it's kind of leads to a lot of interesting what's yet to be discovered thoughts as well, and who else was teaching at the time that we don't know about. They're definitely, the first half of the book, first 2/3 of the book, go with the base of Fabris and overall, and then there's a transition, but it's not set up in chapters the same way, headed chapters, it's just numbered the same way to go into Proceeding with Resolution, but there is some information on that. And the other interesting thing is it moves into a tree, a decision tree, that both does a Proceeding with Resolution and a Still Fighting kind of decision tree, how it's broken down, which it certainly, he could have, this could be something that was normal in a school, or it could have been something that he made himself as a new thing. Hard to tell what this resource was used for, if it was personal or to be published. So lots of questions, but also a neat resource, good addendum to your big fatty Fabris book. And I would recommend picking up a copy to help kind of clarify some things as you're reading through.
Yeah, Letia, one thing that I will add is that, so I know that Leone has done some additional research since the beginning of this book. He discussed it a little bit, since he published this book, his translation. He discussed it a little bit at Lord Baltimore's challenge. I'm going to respect his integrity and the right to his research as an author, and not say specifically what he said, but I will say that there's a little bit more known about what's going to happen, about what the context for this work is, and hopefully he will either put that out publicly, or I am giving a class on Vienna Anonymous in the upcoming Atlantia Winter University, where I'm going to ask him to see if I can release some of that additional research. But awesome. Otherwise, yeah, Vienna Anonymous is a great book. So I believe there's some stuff in the chat. Letia, I can't.
Yeah, I caught it. We're good.
Okay, so we're good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to go into Huessler next. All right, here we go. So Huessler published the New Illustrated Fencing Manual in 1615. So once again, really right in kind of the wake of Fabris's published manual, at least his widely published manual. The 1600 version of Fabris was, I believe was mostly kept to himself or was a draft that wasn't widely distributed. So when we're talking about the 1606 original Fabris manual, then we have the Vienna Anonymous being written in 1614, but not published. Huessler was published in 1615 and is one of the first German examples of what we see as a continuation of the Fabris tradition. And you see this throughout the 1600s of German masters and German fencers in general learning the Fabris tradition. So Sebastian Huessler, he was from Nuremberg. He came from a printer family and had a successful printing practice. And then basically what we know is that he abandoned it. And I believe he still drew income from it, but decided that he wanted to really be a full-time fencer and soldier. So he had a family and decided to, kind of pursue the way of the sword. So what we know is that he learned Fabris through the course of his travels throughout Europe, and also paying, as he says, to learn fencing from different masters. And I have I have a reference that he has where he brings this up. So you can see in this passage right here, he says, "I had the courage to travel throughout Italy, France, England, and the Netherlands, and was drawn to famous and artful fencing masters, learning at the same time and paying them money. According to this, however, in front of all others, I had as the singular teacher the gentleman Salvatorem Fabri de Padua. And like those who are heard of to boast of learning many years ago from Salvatore Fabri, and like those before, I have also followed suit and explored further the free art, sparing no effort, diligence, or expense. And with the help of God, I've learned many beautiful techniques, and some of the most artful pieces I've collected and carefully collated and described here." So we know right now at this point that from this passage and from what he talks about later on in the book, that Huessler is directly in the lineage of Fabris. It's a little bit vague about whether he learned directly from Fabris himself or whether he learned it kind of tangentially. But we do know that it was in that era. And Huessler's manual, which was published relatively recently by Kevin Moore, who is, by the way, just a fantastic guy and is an experienced translator of HEMA texts, specifically German ones. So very detailed text and illustrated. You can see right here. So he both adds to the Fabris tradition and kind of fleshes it out from his perspective. Additionally, there's another passage that he says, so within our 500 plays with single rapier as well as with rapier and dagger of the world famous fencing and instruction master Sig Salvatore Fabri from Padua, as well as other Italian and French masters. So you're going to see this as a continuing theme where these German masters learn Fabris, and you really kind of use that as the cornerstone of how they publish and their understanding of fencing, and then include other things that they that enhance their understanding enough that they decide to publish their own manual. You can see that he also published a book on flag waving in 1615, and basically he continued his life as both a fencing master and a soldier. And we believe that he died in at least after 1645, and he had served in the 30 Years' War under the Danish king. So Huessler, great book, and also really is very much in the Fabris tradition, and you can read it on its own, but it will also enhance your understanding of the Fabris manual. Highly encourage you continue you picking that up if you can.
The comment in the book was in the chat was where to pick up Vien, and if it was on Lulu Press. So we should probably mention.
Yeah. So I think you can get Huessler on Amazon. I got it from Kevin himself, But if you Google Hussler and Maurer, Maurer, you should be able to find that copy. And like I said, if not, you can find Kevin on Facebook, and he'll probably work it out with you himself as well. So the next one I'm going to go into is, and I apologize if I'm butchering this because I do not speak German, is Koopa. So he also is very similar in his approach to Fabris, very explicitly about Fabris. His manual is about Fabris, or at least his interpretation of it. So you can see right here, he's from Magdeburg. He got his doctorate in philosophy and medicine from the University of Wittenberg. And while he was studying there in the very early 1600s, he learned fencing from Heinrich Beller there. I don't believe we have a manual from Heinrich Beller, but he studied fencing and got passionate about fencing, and became enthused about the style of Fabris. And this is one example that we have someone who actually met Fabris. So he says that he met Fabris in Paris, and we know that this isn't just a we know this is true, or at least we know that Fabris was in Paris at the time that he says he was that he met Fabris in Paris in 1608 and 1609, and then supposedly Fabris gave him a copy of his text while he was there, which was published in 1606. The most available translation of Koopa is from Reiner van Noort, and one thing that you can really say about this about his manual is that, like Huessler, it is very derived from Fabris, and so much to the point that in his introduction, Koopa says this. He says, "But I can say and confess with good conscience that indeed you might find something in Fabris and Salvator's book that is not found in mine. Then yet I also hold that you might find in mine what cannot be found in Salvator's. Many other nitpickers go to the place where they belong." And then he continues on to a little bit of talking about, hey, don't copy my book because this is copyrighted by his patron. So this book, like I said, he both includes stuff from Fabris, and he includes some of his own stuff. So very much along the same vein, if you want, you can learn it on your own from Koopa, and you can see from his illustrations that it is very, very Fabris-like in his illustrations and the techniques in it. So that's in 1619. Once again, relatively early on into the continuation of the Fabris lineage. So these are people who either studied from Fabris themselves or really are only like once removed from it. And the next reference that we have to Salvator Fabris, at least for the purposes of this discussion, which is not comprehensive, is Alfieri in 1640. Now, one thing I will say about Alfieri is that Alfieri, unlike the other texts that we're discussing, in practice is not really, you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is just like Fabris, because, and I think David Koblenz, who is part of this discussion right now, I like that he lumps, he likes to say I think it's like a capo Alfieri Giganti as like kind of an amalgam style versus the kind of Fabris approach to fencing, to Italian rapier. But nevertheless, Alfieri does mention Fabris in his book, and how he describes it is when he's talking about the divisions of the sword, and he mentions a lot of different fencing masters. So this is happening in 1640, and he's the fencing master at the Accademia Delia in Padua, which is really kind of a finishing school for the nobility in the Padua area of northern Italy. And he published all sorts of different works on military, like two-handed sword, all flags, all that different stuff. So he talked about all of that, which he assumedly also taught. So he says that his reference to Fabris is he's talking about the divisions of the sword. He says, Salvator Fabris, a man of the greatest name within our profession, divides it in 4 parts, that is to say, into fourths. And then later on he says that he disagrees and he divides it into 5 parts. So we know that Alfieri considers Fabris at that time in 1640 to be a great name in the practice of Italian rapier. And even though a lot of what he does in the manual itself does have more in common with what you would see in in kind of a lunge-centric approach that you'd see in Fabris and in Gigante and Capoferro, nevertheless, there still is frog DNA and influence from Fabris in his manual. But it's not something that I would say you would see immediately if you were watching someone doing Alfieri and they only learned Alfieri. David, do you have any? I'm interested if you have any thoughts on that, because I know you've studied Alfieri probably a little bit more than I have.
I think that, I think some of his theory pieces sound sort of similar to Fabris. I think that where he talks about contratempo, it's similar. But in general, yeah, I more or less agree.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I also found a reference when I was looking at that one on page 15 further in, where he talks about how to hold the body. He does bring up Fabris's kind of bend lean, and talks about it a little, of not trying to do it too much, but doing it in moderation. So that was also something noted as a comparison.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So there are 2 widely available translations of Alfieri. So Letia is mentioning what I assume is the Leone version. I'm using the Terminello and Stewart and Marshall version. I think they're both good. I think I have both. But the discussion of the differences between those translations is probably another conversation for another day. So the last manual that we're going to talk about here is Pasha's C13. And a lot of people will just call it C13 because it's easier, it's shorter. But C13, so Pasha himself is a really interesting guy. He was the son of a servant of the nobility in northern Germany in the Saxony region. So he was born in Dresden, and he really kind of escalated in his life as a teacher. So he was a dancing teacher. He was a secretary. He was a tutor. And I think he was like some sort of like Chamberlain sort of deal. But he was, a pretty respected person who rose up in the world as a professional teacher for the nobility. And he wrote 14 manuals, so a very prolific author. And this is in the late 1600s. From the 1657 is when we think we see his first manual, and then his last manual, that at least is on Wichtenauer, is published posthumously. So he died in 1678. Now and we've got C13 right here, translated by Rainer van Noort and Jan Schaefer. So C13 is kind of an interesting manual because it shares a lot of the material with another manual, another codex that we don't know the author of, which is you can see at the bottom of this slide, MS 17533. But C13 is really Pasha talking about his kind of take on Fabris and his own fencing style that is explicitly coming from the Fabris lineage, and he even enumerates his descendants from the Fabris lineage. So you can see that he learned fencing in the late 1640s, and I believe that was also at a university. No, that was in a town. So he learned that, and then he learned Fabris from a friend, who then learned it from a fencing master named Heinrich von und Zumweld. Once again, I apologize if I butchered that. Who he says learned it from Fabris himself. And this is one thing that Letia mentioned earlier about people, these later fencing masters referencing other fencing masters using abbreviations. And he also references other fencing masters. I mean, a lot of Pasha's stuff references other fencing masters and ones who are also published in that time period. So at least taking him at his word, he's basically so Fabris, the next guy, and then Pasha. But Pasha's manual, you can see that he, at the very beginning of it, he uses as a continuation of his title. So proper description of thrust fencing with a single rapier, recently compiled from the famous Sig Salvatore and other distinguished fencing masters. Now, Pasha has his own style. It's a complete manual. The illustrations are that are in the Van Noort version are actually from MS 17533, which is arguably from earlier on in the 1600s and like around the mid to early mid 1600s. And then once again, this is from 1671. But they do correspond with some of the stuff that is talked about in C13, which doesn't have illustrations itself. Orient this to the screen. So you can see right here, very similar stuff to what you see in Fabris. And you see that in a lot of these later manuals, they have a little bit more of an upright positioning than the more the aggressive forward lean that you see in Fabris, in the Fabris manual itself. But just like people who practice Fabris in HEMA and in the SCA, you have variation. And as long as you're using the concepts, we know that variation is period. And we can see that in the further manuals. So you can learn Pasha on your own, or you can do it as a continuation of your study of Fabris and as kind of a historical and academic ability to learn more about how Fabris's lineage evolved over time. All right, so I'm going to take it off the share screen.
I wanted to make a quick note. Anonymous, much like Pasha, is also only single sword, so it doesn't have any of the sword and dagger or other sword and cloak. And I did not mention that earlier. So
yeah, one thing that I should say is that Huessler does have his own thing on, does have a pretty large section on rapier and dagger. That's actually not in the Maurer translation of Huessler that I have the book of, but it is on Wichtenauer. And I think you can get another translation because he did a later publishing of the translation of Huessler's Rapier and Dagger. I know I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. Before he did the translation of the single rapier stuff. So you can find the rapier and dagger portion of Huessler as well. I like Huessler a lot because he's someone who is really right in the wake of it and talks a lot about Fabris and a lot about how about his approach to his style. It's a big manual. So that's a brief overview of some of the major works. It's not comprehensive. There are lots and lots of masters that were part of the Fabris lineage throughout the 1600s. He's probably, along with Capoferro, one of the most referenced fencing masters from the Italian tradition, if not the most. So there's lots of ways you can continue your study of Fabris and of the Fabris tradition after you're done with Fabris itself. I would recommend probably Vienna Anonymous to start with right away, because it really is just someone's in the period studying Fabris and studying Capoferro and then talking about their footnotes on it. And then you can continue on into some of the other ones. So that's, if you want to study this stuff, great. If you want to just use what we've talked about today, that's fine too. Letia, do you have any other thoughts or observations?
Well, that's about it. Also, I'm always welcome to questions and nerding out about this sort of thing. So feel free to reach out.
Any questions or any thoughts from the peanut gallery? Nope. All right. Hey, everyone, thanks for joining us. Once again, I'll post this up on YouTube, and a little bit of a shorter class, but thank you for coming, and thank you. This is the last Fabris Luncheon, but so thank you for listening to us drone on during your lunchtime, or not so lunchtime for your another time zone. So have a great day.
Thank you, guys.